These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Hi, my friends. This is These Small Hours podcast, and I am Russell Cordell Staker. Tonight it is the 28th of July, 2021. I'm here in Austin, Texas. The heat switch finally got switched on. I hope this finds you well. I'm going to read to you an essay I've written tonight. I've titled this Approaching That Naked Reality by Russell Cordell Staker. Taped to the bottom of the monitor at my writing desk are the words, "Novelist plumbed the soul's depths." These words, now yellowed, are taken from a newspaper clipping of a Los Angeles Times obituary I carefully cut from the paper on the morning of November 2nd, 2006. William Styron was dead. Now that he was gone, I took only minor comfort in knowing that his books still existed on my shelves and that I would continue to read them, which I have. In the years since his death, I've made Styron my literary godfather for reasons I won't bother to get into here, save to say that his voice comforts and advises me in the small hours when the writing is agony. It was because Styron did plumb the soul's depths that I trust him the most. His writing came painstakingly slow, but he persisted to write every day. He admitted, "Writing is an agony, yet if I don't do it, I am defeating myself. It breaks my heart and my back and my fingers. It's never as right as I want it to be." In life, nothing comes easily, and I am grateful it doesn't, even though I am loath to admit I am. I'd liked something to come easy just once in my life, and most particularly in my writing life. Some things I consider are mostly just distant abstractions of ideas in the form of something profound to say, and usually too airy and elusive to worry about. Art is no different than truth. It arrives only of itself and entirely when it means to, and not because I have any say in the matter. Norman MacLean, sitting at the edge of the Big Blackfoot with his father and brother Paul, noted the sound of the river making sounds to itself, and now it made sounds to us. It was his father who taught him early in life that grace comes by art, and art does not come easy. I think to work at something long enough means eventually getting to hear its sound, which happens to be the sound of your own voice. The more you do it, the more you recognize its sound. You get to know its quality and eventually trust it. Good things take time. Finding time and then working diligently in small, often futile increments of time is the key. There, somehow, and against all odds, I attempt to plumb the depths of my soul to figure out what it really means to be a writer. The effort is worth all the despair, or so I keep telling myself. To create in the midst of the desert, as Albert Camus suggested, is the best ambition of art, and more so of life. Art is the antidote to nihilism and futility. It is the reason for declaring we are alive now, and intent on being alive and understanding why living matters. To try to make something in this space of time with all its frustration and obstruction is quite possibly the point altogether. No further accolade is necessary. As Camus suggests, thinking is learning all over again to see, to be attentive, to focus consciousness. It is turning every idea and every image in the manner of Proust into a privileged moment. What justifies thought is its extreme consciousness. The king Sisyphus of Ephyra was made to suffer an eternal punishment. His task was one of naked futility, whereby he would, over and over again, roll an immense boulder up a treacherous mountainside, only to watch it roll back down every time he approached the top. His labor was such that he had no power but to turn and slide back down to commence again, to roll the boulder to the top of the mountain, knowing full well the damn thing was never going to rest at the summit. There would be no end to this repeated burden, this mindless, unavailing expenditure of Sisyphus's best willful spirit and dogged determination. Camus wrote that perhaps the great work of art has less importance in itself than in the ordeal it demands of a man and the opportunity it provides him of overcoming his phantoms and approaching a little closer his naked reality. Of Sisyphus, Camus concludes, "The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy." Novelist plumbed the soul's depths. These are the first words I see in that early hour when I rise to write in the morning. The print and texture of the paper is yellowed and worn. It has traveled hard with me. Adjacent to these words is a silhouette image of a man working a mop with all his solitary might. I consider the thoughts he keeps as he labors under the shadow of the eave of the great hall above a shining floor he prepares for countless feet to walk upon. During the course of the coming day, the floor will lose its luster, but in spite of this most naked futility, I imagine a smile on the man's face. RCS, 25 July, 2021. And that is my essay for this evening. I'd like to read a little piece of something that William Styron wrote in his 1990 book, Darkness Visible, a memoir of madness. And you'll have to forgive me because I'm gonna turn to the page here. And just a little touch on this before I read this particular couple of snippets over a couple of few pages that have come back to me just recently. He's writing here of Albert Camus, who was a writer that he revered as he was coming up as a writer. And I will also say at the outset that it was because of William Styron, who I wrote in my essay, which you've just heard. I've deemed him or bequeathed him, I don't know if that's the right word, or given him the honor, whether he wants it or not, of being my literary godfather. Now, that might sound a bit presumptuous to anybody out there, but I'm not going to get into all the reasons for that. But there's a personal kinship that I've felt with Styron. I've felt it for a very long time. And it was because of William Styron that I started reading Albert Camus and have been meaning to for years. I didn't really start reading Camus until just this past year. And I'm nearly through his entire works at this juncture. I'll probably finish up here in the next month or two. But I also feel like the timing of me coming to Camus was exactly right. But I knew years ago, because of my reading of Styron, and particularly of this book and some of what I'm about to read to you, that I was going to eventually get to Camus. So that's where this is. So he's speaking of Camus. Styron writes, "When I was a young writer, there had been a stage where Camus, almost more than any other contemporary literary figure, radically set the tone for my own view of life and history. I read his novel, The Stranger, somewhat later than I should have. I was in my early 30s. But after finishing it, I received the stab of recognition that proceeds from reading the work of a writer who has wedded moral passion to a style of great beauty, and whose unblinking vision is capable of frightening the soul to its marrow. The cosmic loneliness of Mersault, the hero of that novel, so haunted me that when I set out to write the Confessions of Nat Turner, I was impelled to use Camus's device of having the story flow from the point of view of a narrator isolated in his jail cell during the hours before his execution." And then a bit further on, I'm going to grab another portion of where he's going with this. He said that Camus was a great cleanser of my intellect, ridding me of countless sluggish ideas, and through some of the most unsettling pessimism I had ever encountered, causing me to be aroused anew by life's enigmatic promise. And then I'm going to go a little bit further here. So Camus wrote a book, which I read about 3 months ago, actually, for the first time, that Styron is going to touch on here, and it's entitled The Myth of Sisyphus, which is and also other essays. So it was combined, but he wrote a book entitled The Myth of Sisyphus, and it just blew me away when I read that. And Styron speaks of that very book here, and I just recently reread this book by Styron. I'd read this years and years ago, and then I read it 2 or 3 times again in 2017, and I was reminded of this, that I need to read Myth of Sisyphus, and then I just finally read it just a few months ago, and then I came back to this book and read what I'm about to share with you here, and it just really hit home here. So it's just a short thing. He says, William Styron writes, he says, "The myth of Sisyphus, with its austere message, in the absence of hope, we must still struggle to survive, and so we do, by the skin of our teeth." That's really deep, and I think that's probably where I woke up one morning about 2 weeks ago, and I had this thought. I was thinking about Sisyphus, and I was thinking about my own life, and I'm thinking about just this continuity, day in, day out. I get up and I write, and there's a lot of uncertainty around the work that I do, and not knowing if this is going to turn out to be anything, and it probably won't. Odds are against me that it will, but I still do this because I'm okay with where I'm at. And much like the myth of Sisyphus, who rolled that rock to the top of the hill and over again, I've accepted my fate as being what it is. And it's not just writing. I want to be clear here. There's so much more to my life than just this idea of me being a writer. I recognize and I'm about, I do all kinds of things, and there are things that are coming in front of me that it's just a continuity of life sometimes has a way of doing its own thing, and I have to ride along with that and still find the joy in the uncertainty. And so when Styron died in 2006, I was living in Los Angeles at the time. Actually, I was living in Thousand Oaks. And I was reading the Los Angeles Times that morning, and I saw that he'd passed away. And I knew that he was getting up there in age. He was 81 when he died, but it really, really hit me hard because I loved William Styron. And it was a sad feeling because I knew that voice was silent now. Much like any writer or artist, when an artist leaves us, there's that thought that initially I still have what that artist left behind, and thank God for that. But it's also the reality that for the rest of my life, that artist will have nothing further to say. And that really profoundly hit me with William Styron. And I cut that article out of the Los Angeles Times. And I've carried it with me ever since. It's very yellowed. And the first portion of that article of the obituary says novelist plumbed the soul's depths. And I've attached that to the bottom of my typing monitor or my typewriter. For a while, I worked on a typewriter. Sometimes I handwrite. I do most of my writing now in Google Docs. But anyway, it's always on my monitor because it reminds me of what I feel in my heart I'm trying to do as well. And Styron did so powerfully. And I was thinking about the word plumb, not the fruit, but to plumb is to go straight down or up vertically to a complete degree. And again, plum fruit is P-L-U-M. We know that. I'm talking about P-L-U-M-B here. But to plumb the soul's depths straight down or up vertically to a complete degree exactly, to measure the depth of, to examine minutely and critically, true, thorough, complete. Or we think about the measurement of the depth of body of water, to plumb the depth of water. And so this is always in my mind when I sit down to write in the morning, which is a daunting thing. And I think, well, maybe I shouldn't put that on my monitor because maybe I'm being too diligent or too serious in this work. Lighten up, Russell. And I'm sure there are people that are going to tell me that. Believe it or not, I'm actually a really funny guy too. But right now where I'm at in my progression is I'm really digging deep, and it's made this first novel that I've been writing very, very difficult because in many ways it's very personal. And I think every book is to a certain extent. But as I was getting this idea for this essay, I was thinking about what Styron meant to me. So the choice of a writer and the sound of his voice, I think, is the thing that seems to come back. I've certainly recognized that. For me, there is no other option but to write down into the depths, to discover what there is and bring it back up to the light, to the surface. But the agony and the effort that goes into it at times, and also just the uncertainty. And I just think, what is it I'm really seeing down there? Am I finding something that's worth all of this effort? And when I read that quote, and I wrote it in my essay of Styron, and I came across that a while back in another book of essays that he'd written, Havanas and Camelot was the book that I took that from. It meant so much to me because I realized that my literary godfather, as I've deemed him, had written about the pain and the agony of writing. And every writer, I think, understands that. Any artist understands that there's an isolated feeling of being out there completely on your own, and you really don't know what you're going to do, but you're pushing forward anyway, and it's backbreaking. It's a painstakingly slow work for me. It certainly was for William Styron. And by the way, I don't want to compare myself to him. I'm not. But his influence on me and his advice and the sound and the tenor or the timbre of his voice, it comes back, it reinforces itself. And I reach for Styron all the time as a comfort to just tell me, it's okay, Russell, keep going. So again, Styron writing is an agony. Yet if I don't do it, I am defeating myself. It breaks my heart and my back and my fingers. It's never as right as I want it to be. And I think maybe that also is the point. It never is. And maybe it's supposed to be that way as a reflection of just the mess of life as we find it. As I do when I read, I've mentioned this before, I kind of go through this ratatouille process where I'll be thinking down one swim lane, of maybe a particular writer or a work or an idea that I have. And then another swim lane comes in and another and another. And as I was writing this essay, very naturally and elegantly, Norman Maclean came back. He's another writer that is very important to me. And I was thinking of Robert Redford, my favorite actor, and his adaptation of Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. And I thought about the Big Blackfoot River, which I've actually been near. I've been to the Big Blackfoot. It's been many, many years outside of Montana or in Missoula area. And it separates itself from the Little Blackfoot. Now, I'm not a Montana native, so maybe I don't get all of this right. But the influence of that river and the sound of the river, that when I read Norman Maclean's book, it resonated with me because I understood that. And any of us if you've ever fished, and I'm not a fisherman, I've tried, I've fished now and then, but just to be alongside the water. But the metaphor of fishing in the book, and also just the sound of the water and the rocks, it really came back strongly. And as I was thinking about Styron plumbing the depths. So, the river making sounds to itself that Norman Maclean writes about. The Big Blackfoot River is that glorious snow-fed, spring-fed river in western Montana that runs some 74 miles long. Excuse me. It begins at the continental divide of the Americas and so beautifully rendered and featured in Norman Maclean's 1976 novella, as I've just mentioned, A River Runs Through It. And then it's added unto in just such a powerful way through the voice, literally the speaking voice, the narrative voice that Robert Redford lends as the grown-up or the late in life Norman Maclean, who's actually played by Craig Sheffer in the film, but it's Redford who's the narrator of the same Norman Maclean in the movie. The story that was written by Maclean, it spans his entire lifetime. It spans his early life to the point of his brother Paul's death. And then there's this epilogue of perspective right at the conclusion of that. So Norman Maclean was born in 1902. He's actually born in Iowa, but his family, I think by the time he was 7 or 8, moved to Missoula. And that became their home. His father was a Presbyterian minister. And his brother Paul, who is his younger brother, I think by 4 or 5 years, and I could be getting that wrong, was brutally killed, murdered, in a terrible fight in 1938. And it was in many ways, it was the impetus and the desire that Norman Maclean had for the rest of his life to go back and to reflect on the life that he had growing up with his brother and with his father and his mother. And he wrote this novella when he was a professor at the University of Chicago. He studied at Dartmouth, and it was published in 1976 or 77. And then he died in 1990, and Redford made the film in 92. It's a very moving tale, and it's something that when he speaks about the sound of the river, I think it really lends itself powerfully to this idea of plumbing the soul's depths. And for me personally, as I've grown up into a man, these are little things that I've noticed from very early on. And when I would read these writers and I would see these films per se, or this particular film, there were these little moments where I was recognizing something deeper inside of me that I recognized somewhere else. It's a weird kind of feeling. And I don't mean weird, that's the wrong word. It's a special kind of feeling. And they've always stayed with me, these sounds. And as I've continued to pursue my own writing and I continue to read, these sounds are getting more clear, and I'm recognizing a sound in my own voice. I would like to read a little bit from Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It. So hang on one second here. I've got to reach over here and grab my book, my copy of this. So this is right at the end of his novella, which is very spare but extremely powerful. And it's a book that it's one of my favorites. But its favorite doesn't do it the service that it means here. It's akin to a spiritual scripture in many ways. It's soul edifying. So Norman Maclean writes, "A river, though, has so many things to say that it is hard to know what it says to each of us. As we were packing our tackle and fish in the car, Paul repeated, 'Just give me 3 more years.' At the time, I was surprised at the repetition, but later I realized that the river somewhere, sometime, must have told me too, that he would receive no such gift." I'm sorry. I'm going to apologize right now. I'm going to do my best to read this. I've been reading this for a long damn time, and it gets me every time. I told myself earlier, I was like, dude, this is tricky. You're going to read Norman MacLean on a podcast here, and this is a tough one, so please bear with me. I'm not trying to... You're just going to have to ride with me. I'll hold my emotion in. And I'm back to MacLean now. For when the police sergeant early next May wakened me before daybreak, I rose and asked no questions. Come on, Russell, you can do this. Together we drove across the Continental Divide and down the length of the Big Blackfoot River, over the forest floors, yellow and sometimes white with glacier lilies, to tell my father and mother that my brother had been beaten to death by the butt of a revolver and his body dumped in an alley. My mother turned and went to her bedroom, where, in a house full of men and rods and rifles, she had faced most of her great problems alone. She was never to ask me a question about the man she loved most and understood least. Perhaps she knew enough to know that for her, it was enough to have loved him. He was probably the only man in the world who held her in his arms and leaned back and laughed. When I finished talking to my father, he asked, "Is there anything else you can tell me?" Finally, I said nearly all the bones in his hand were broken. He almost reached the door and then turned back for reassurance. "Are you sure that the bones in his hand were broken?" he asked. I repeated, "Nearly all the bones in his hand were broken." "In which hand?" he asked. "In his right hand," I answered. After my brother's death, my father never walked very well again. He had to struggle to lift his feet, and when he did get them up, they came down slightly out of control. From time to time, Paul's right hand had to be reaffirmed. When my father would shuffle away again, he could not shuffle in a straight line from trying to lift his feet. Like many Scottish ministers before him, he had to derive what comfort he could from the faith that his son had died fighting. For some time, though, he struggled for more to hold on to. "Are you sure you've told me everything you know about his death?" he asked. I said, "Everything." "It's not much, is it?" "No," I replied. "But you can love completely without complete understanding." "That I have known and preached," my father said. "Do you think I could have helped him?" I answered. We stood waiting in deference to each other. How can a question be answered that asks a lifetime of questions? "All I really know is that he was a fine fisherman." "You know more than that," my father said. "He was beautiful." "Yes," I said, "he was beautiful. He should have been. You taught him." My father looked at me for a long time. He just looked at me. So this was the last he and I ever said to each other about Paul's death. Indirectly, though, he was present in many of our conversations. Once, for instance, my father asked me a series of questions that suddenly made me wonder whether I understood even my father, whom I felt closer to than any man I have ever known. "You like to tell stories, don't you?" he asked. And I answered, "Yes, I like to tell stories that are true." Then he asked, "After you have finished your true stories sometime, why don't you make up a story and the people to go with it? Only then will you understand what happened and why. It is those we live with and love and should know who elude us." Now I'm going to stop right there. There are 3 more paragraphs right to the very end of that. But what I'm going to do now is I would like to bring in what Redford did in the film in 1992. And as I've done in many podcasts, if you have continued to listen with me, just lend an ear because I will pull all of this together in the end. And I apologize. The emotion is strong, and I'm not going to hide this. I'm letting this go. When I do these recordings, I let this out. So you're just going to have to ride this with me because I'll draw this together. So stick with me. Robert Redford, at the very end of the film, just to set this a little bit, the sequence that he films is back in Missoula, and it's at the end of Reverend MacLean's life. He was a minister, a Presbyterian minister, and he is giving the sermon in church. And we see Norman, who is older. His family is there. He's with his mother, and obviously Reverend MacLean, played by Tom Skerritt. They have all aged. And he's giving this sermon. And Norman, in this moment, draws back to what I was just reading. And I think Redford captured this right. And what I really love is what Tom Skerritt says in this first portion. And then Redford's voice finishes out the film. So this first little bit, this is what Tom Skerritt, who played Reverend McLean, says. To each one of us here today, will at one time in our lives look upon a loved one who is in need and ask the same question. We are willing to help, Lord, but what if anything is needed? For it is true that we can seldom help those closest to us. Either we don't know what part of ourselves to give, or more often than not, the part we have to give is not wanted, and so it is those we live with and should know who elude us. But we can still love them. We can love completely without complete understanding. And at that point, the film goes into its very ending, and now we hear the voice of Robert Redford, who is Norman McLean, at the very end of his life, out fishing the big waters on the Big Blackfoot. Now nearly all those I loved and did not understand in my youth are dead, even Jesse, but I still reach out to them. Of course, now I'm too old to be much of a fisherman, and now I usually fish the big waters alone, although some friends think I shouldn't. But when I'm alone in the half-light of the canyon, all existence seems to fade to a being, with my soul and memories and the sounds of the Big Blackfoot River and a 4-count rhythm and the hope that a fish will rise. Eventually, all things merge into one, and a river runs through it. The river was cut by the world's great flood and runs over rocks from the basement of time. On some of the rocks are the timeless raindrops. Under the rocks are the words, and some of the words are theirs. I am haunted by waters. The sound of that river, chatting to itself as it were, the sound that Norman McLean heard in the river, the water over the rocks, the water under the rocks. The sound of his own voice as a writer, the sound of Styron's voice in those painstaking moments when it was backbreaking. It broke his fingers. It was never as right as he wanted it to be, but he was searching for that something. Albert Camus, being able to eviscerate the sluggishness that William Styron felt and some of the ideas that he had, but also to take that over to think of Camus, who in such a powerful and yet very quiet voice said things that were so profound. And I can imagine also the solitude that he must have felt as he was at work, plumbing his own soul's depths. These are voices that are gone, but they're still here. And wherever they've gone, I'm reaching for them just as they reached for the voices that mattered to them. And it's not only voices in the sound of the artist and the art that is created and built in this space of what feels like sometimes in this world we live, almost nihilistic, where people think, what's the meaning? It doesn't matter. This life is a nothing. It's easy to get caught up in that. We go to work, we do our jobs, we do these things that are mindless. We go through the routines of our day, and yet there's this piercing quality in the sound of the water, the Big Blackfoot. Now, I know we don't all live by the Big Blackfoot, and I'm not suggesting that's the only place you can hear it, but it's the metaphor that I'm reaching for here. We seek our way amid these ruins, and this was very profoundly true as I was writing. And again, I'm so sorry. I'm going to get a hold of this emotion, but this is very real for me. And I'm also, I've talked about this before, but I'm right at the very end of my novel too. And there is a really powerful part of this that is coming out as I'm writing, and I'm finishing something that I just feel like I'm never going to get done with, and I'm finally almost there. So the point is to live. It's to create while we do so in this sublime feature of force in the face of this futility, as I talked about, that brings the purest of insight and thereby joy, and this joy of feeling on this earth by participating in its own eternally unfurling, as I like to think of it sometimes. I was thinking the other day, there was a big storm that rolled in. We've had a lot of these here in Texas, and huge thunder one night. I mean, it was it was actually kind of scary, and the sound, the very electricity in the clouds, it was angry. It was very, very powerful. And you just realize how small and insignificant you are in that moment. And the imagination that I had was like, man, I hope this house can withstand this broad thundering. But that electricity that's left in the clouds to strike where and when it will, who are we to dictate its terms? And maybe in the same sort of way, there is this electricity inside of us that we want to control. We want to say, oh, there's a reason why I resonate with this, or I've got this passion for something else or whatever. And maybe it's the ordeal. It's not the production of what actually comes, although I think the effort is what I'm getting at here, but it beckons us to strike with the force that we have inside of us, that sound. And it's something that I keep coming back to as I keep pressing on this thing that I'm doing as I write, this thing that I do as I read, this thing that I do as I go out into my life, as I'm with my kids, I'm with my wife, I'm in the world, the jobs that I'm going to be doing here shortly, the things that I've done in the past. There are these reminders that the art of and in our lives is the effort to make it. It's not actually the production of what comes out, it's the effort. And sometimes I think we forget that. And I have to remember that. So that's where this emotion is coming from, because I put so much preponderance on this idea that if I don't complete a book, let's say, and I just end up being a plumber for the rest of my life, and this is not to denigrate that, or maybe being a sales professional or a doctor, it does not matter. But if we subjugate ourselves to the point where we just say, well, I can't be what I really want to be because I'm just not good enough, so I'm just not going to try, we've missed the whole point. Camus wrote about that, and I mentioned this in my essay, that but perhaps the great work of art has less importance in itself than in the ordeal it demands of a man or a woman, I'm putting in woman there, and the opportunity it provides him of overcoming his phantoms and approaching a little closer to his naked reality. And so the title of my essay, Approaching That Naked Reality. I want to jump now back to the unavailing expenditure of Sisyphus's best willful spirit and dogged determination as I wrote it. That's from my sentence directly from my essay there. Approaching a little closer his naked reality. It's a consideration of that naked reality. What was his? Was it the rock? And what is man's naked reality? And actually, I think that's really an unfair loaded question. We are so individual that it shouldn't just be a general. I think there are some thematic elements there that are universal to all of us. But what is yours? What is your naked reality? What is mine? These are the rhetorical sorts of things that I think it's okay to ask, and it's okay to say there isn't really an answer, but it's worth pursuing. There is no answer. But when we're standing at that handle of the mop, so this is where I'm going to go back to this image that I also have attached to my writing place. It's been with me for a long time. So next to this novelist plumbs the soul's depths, I cut out a picture of a man with a mop, just as I described it in the essay, and I won't reiterate that. If you want to hear my essay again, go back. But he's doing his job, and it's a silhouette of this man. And I look at that man every morning when I write. Cleaning those floors. And I think to myself, why would I put a picture of a man with a mop cleaning floors that countless feet are going to walk over, that nobody's going to know who that guy was? How often do we see the cleaner? How often do we stop and really wonder about that person? I think we know that our concern is to do the work anyway, even though there's this futile sense that mopping that floor, moving that rock, it may not really get us anywhere. But to smile while we're doing it, wow, that's powerful. We see ourselves at our purest and most vulnerable, and I think the most real. And you're going to have to forgive me because I'm going to go wipe my nose really quick. The magic is that ordeal. There is, or in lies, the opportunity to overcome the phantoms that Camus mentioned, to brush them away, as I was thinking about it, as if it's like a foul air, to get to the real inner voice that says when we're listening, there you are. And in those small moments, the sound of that voice, which is our most naked voice, suggests something we can do or feel or know, or, best of all, create. I think that's the point. We get to a point where there's this voice we start to recognize in ourselves. And I'm using the word voice. It can mean a lot of different things in terms of output. But if it spurs us along to the point where we say, hey, this world is this, sometimes it's this nihilistic, almost nothingness, which it isn't. But the world wants us to think that sometimes. If we, in spite of that and in the face of that feeling, can say, I'm still going to take some time to create, even though when everything's against me, there are too many debts to pay, my job sucks, or I don't have a job, Or, maybe my relationship with my spouse is strained because the realities of our lives are so hard that we're trench working, even though we love each other or whatever. I'm just saying this all just in a general universal way. These are things we all relate to. And yet in the midst of that, to say there is something inside of me that I can still create in spite of all of that, then I think we've won. And one's probably the wrong way to say it, because that means that there's a conclusion. I don't think there is a conclusion, but it allows us to get to that naked reality that says we can stand up against this. Hard against the wind, Bob Seger sings about in one of his songs, Against the Wind. To stand hard against the wind, even though the wind is doing everything to knock us back on our ass. The sound of that most naked voice declares, as we set out to try, and I think that's the point, to try. Alas, off you are. That's what I hear. And it just tells me, Russell, you got to keep going, because it doesn't matter if nobody picks up on it, but I'm doing this because it's helping me to get wherever it is I'm trying to figure out I'm going. And I think we all have that inside of us. We just have to find out what it is. The struggle quite possibly is enough. And this leads me to the Sisyphus portion that was, it's taken from Homer's Iliad, Book 6. And I've mentioned in a previous podcast, I did a lot of reading of Homer in college. And I guess I glossed over the whole Sisyphus thing because it wasn't until reading Styron and then eventually getting to Camus that I really paid attention to this. And of course, Albert Camus, what he writes about is just phenomenal. I'm going to read a little portion directly from his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. Just as context, in the post-Homeric times, Sisyphus was called the father of Odysseus. I did not know that, or if I did, I just don't remember being told that. I guess I wasn't paying attention, which was fascinating to me. So all of this is nestled into the vast panoply of Greek mythology, of literature, and then the representations on the visual media that dates back to what they call the geometric period of 900 BC onward. These drawings, a lot of this was really derived of Sisyphus. And if you Google it, you'll see images of a man, pushing the rock up the hill. I guess I was aware of it, but just not really conscious of what that was until I read this Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. And it just really was like, wow. Tasks that are both laborious and futile are called Sisyphean. So if you hear somebody say that, that's what that is. We all have Sisyphean tasks. That's a fun word to say, by the way, or a fun name to say. I'm going to read just a portion of what Camus wrote in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus and Other Essays, which was published in 1955, 5 years before he was tragically killed in a car accident at the age of 46. Camus writes that the god had condemned Sisyphus to ceaselessly rolling a rock to the top of a mountain, whence the stone would fall back of its own weight. They had thought with some reason that there is no more dreadful punishment than futile and hopeless labor. All Sisyphus's silent joy is contained therein. His fate belongs to him. His rock is his thing. Likewise, the absurd man, when he contemplates his torment, silences all the idols. In the universe suddenly restored to its silence, the myriad wondering little voices of the earth rise up. Unconscious, secret calls, invitations from all the faces, they are the necessary reverse and price of victory. There is no sun without shadow, and it is essential to know the night. The absurd man says yes, and his effort will henceforth be unceasing. If there is a personal fate, there is no higher destiny, or at least there is but one which he concludes is inevitable and despicable. For the rest, he knows himself to be the master of his days. And this, pay attention to this, at that subtle moment when man glances backward over his life, Sisyphus returning toward his rock. In that slight pivoting, he contemplates that series of unrelated actions which becomes his fate, created by him, combined under his memory's eye, and soon sealed by his death. Thus convinced of the wholly human origin of all that is human, a blind man eager to see who knows that the night has no end, he is still on the go. The rock is still rolling. And I thought to myself, this is so you, Russell. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. And isn't that the truth? We always do. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. And Camus concludes, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. I was so profoundly moved when I read that. And to come back to the beginning and to draw this to an end, I want to return to William Styron. who speaks of a contralto voice. And I'm going to read another little portion from his book, Darkness Visible, A Memoir of Madness, in which he speaks of laughter and ability and sighing and frocks and curls. And just to give a little context to this book that he wrote was actually, it was a series of lectures, or it was a lecture, I think, that he gave, and that then turned itself into a book. And it was him being very open about his struggle with major depression. And it's a powerful, powerful book. If you have a chance and you haven't read it, this is one everybody needs to read this. You know, we all walk around thinking, oh, you know what, I'm okay. That we all deal with this in some form. And William Styron wrote so eloquently and so openly about this that it's profoundly moving and it's edifying and it's informative in terms of how we manage this black hole sometimes that comes into our lives. William Styron was in the throes of this massive depression, and he comes to the precipice. And in this particular portion that I'm going to read to you, this is the point where he realizes that he's not going to give up. He's going to get help. And I want to read that. So give me a moment while I turn the page here. Yeah, here we are. Okay. So this is William Styron. Late one bitterly cold night, when I knew that I could not possibly get myself through the following day, I sat in the living room of the house, bundled up against the chill. Something had happened to the furnace. My wife had gone to bed, and I had forced myself to watch the tape of a movie in which a young actress who had been in a play of mine was cast in a small part. At one point in the film, which was set in late 19th century Boston, the characters moved down the hallway of a music conservatory, beyond the walls of which, from unseen musicians, came a contralto voice. A sudden soaring passage from the Brahms Alto Rhapsody. This sound, which like all music, indeed like all pleasure, I had been numbly unresponsive to for months, pierced my heart like a dagger. And in a flood of swift recollection, I thought of all the joys the house had known, the children who had rushed through its rooms, the festivals, the love and work, the honestly earned slumber, the voices, and the nimble commotion. The perennial tribe of cats and dogs and birds, laughter and ability and sighing and frocks and curls. All this I realized was more than I could ever abandon, even as what I had set out so deliberately to do was more than I could inflict on these memories and upon those so close to me with whom the memories were bound. And just as powerfully, I realized I could not commit this desecration on myself. I drew upon some last gleam of sanity to perceive the terrifying dimensions of the mortal predicament I had fallen into. I woke up my wife, and soon telephone calls were made. The next day, I was admitted to the hospital. Though this is a dire and extreme moment, I wondered, as Styron put it, how numbly unresponsive I have often been in the futile, naked reality of my own sometimes seeming hard-knock life, only to be reminded by a contralto voice of all the frocks and curls, all the laughter, all the joy. And in the burden of the work of this life, how necessary, essential, and vital it is to this entire experience. It is the reason to live and a reason to keep writing. And I want to emphasize something here too. You know, underneath this, there is a great joy in recognizing the dark with the light and understanding the frailty as well as the strength that we dance with. And when I read that phrase, the frocks and the curls, just the sound of those two words, frocks and curls, I think touches on that ebb and that flow of what this life is really about. And it's so worth this effort, that this naked futility leads us to our own naked reality. And certainly something I've been considering as I get further into my own work, as well as all of the other work tied to that work and the work that's not tied to it, that is just part of life. So his rock is his thing, as Camus tells us of Sisyphus. My rock is mine. Your rock is yours. So at the subtle moment when a man glances backward over his life, or a woman looks back over her life, I have a sense of what he or she will remember the most. I know what I'm thinking about. And I'm not there yet. God, I hope not. I hope I've still got a long time to go. But in knowing that, I consider I have a sense of what I will remember the most, what we will remember the most. I think you do as well. And that's something that I just want to impart upon you as we part, for at least this particular juncture of these small hours to consider until the next time we meet up again for the next podcast. The smile in the throes of the burden is the art. So just remember that when you're in that dark spot and you're pressing that mop, and again, metaphor or not, some of us do. And I like those moments when I do dishes or I'm doing a mop, or, I've done a lot of hard work and I got hard work in front of me. The moments when I feel my best are when I can still smile and say, you know what, this is magic, even though it may feel like shoveling shit sometimes, and that's okay. So as an epilogue and a conclusion, I just want to say that, I'm just a writer and I'm making my way. But in the next few weeks, I'm now going to become an official plumber too. So I'm going to be installing and repairing pipes and fittings of water supply and sanitation and heating and cooling systems, and learning things that I never thought I would learn before. And I'm really excited about this new endeavor. I'm excited about the service that I'm going to get to give. I'm excited about the experience of what I'm going to experience. I'm probably going to have my head in a trench for a while. I'm going to be underneath houses. But I'm going to get to see something that I didn't think I would have seen before, and it just further emphasizes this joy of the journey that I'm on. I don't know where all of this goes. All I know is that it lends itself, like Norman MacLean talked about, to the sound of my own big Blackfoot River. So maybe now I can face a more naked reality of myself, and I'm grateful for that. A plumber in the depth of his own experience, and soon a novelist with a book that can actually say, yeah, I wrote a novel, and it's almost here. To be able to climb down into the soul's depths and then climb back out and have something to say that maybe offers a voice for somebody else far down the line from where I'm at even today. And if not, at least it was worth the effort to try. And in my own voice, to carry on what my literary godfather, William Styron, certainly contended with and offered to me, even though he never knew me in this life, and I have no idea if he'll ever know me in wherever it is we go, if there is anything after this. But he's certainly a writer that if I ever had the chance to go up to, I want to tell him that I looked up to him and that his words did matter. And I know that he would say the same of other writers. Certainly Albert Camus was one of his, and has also become one of mine as well because of William Styron. So with that, I will leave you and bid you adieu. I hope that you have a wonderful evening. Just keep being yourself, and remember the naked reality that you face. It's your own. Your rock is yours, but make it yours, and keep trying anyway. Find those little efforts to be creative and express what's in your heart, because guess what? There are other people that are watching, and they want what you've got, even though it may feel like maybe that's not the case. But anyway, I wish you well until the next time. Thank you for being a listener. It's a real honor to put these tones out into the universe. Sometimes I think it's like putting out a sound that's going to travel the expanse of time, and maybe it's going to hit another star far, far from here someday, but maybe this voice will carry and offer something of value. If not, I know that it's helping me as I do my own work, and in the end, I'm smiling while I do it. So, good evening. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.